Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant paper, aiming to break down its complexities so you can get right to the core of a major debate in sustainability.
Yeah, we're getting into challenges for implementing an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. It's led by James H. Cowan Jr. from 2012, but look at the author list. It's huge. Names like Jake Rice, Carl Walters, Ray Hilborn.
Heavy hitters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This tells you it's a deeply considered piece, drawing on, well, a massive amount of collective experience.
Okay, so let's frame the central issue here. We constantly hear about the ecosystem approach to fisheries, EAF, as the big fix for overfishing.
Right, the necessary evolution.
But the authors jump right in and say, hold on, the science needed for real EAF thinking about everything, currents, economics, communities, it's often seen as just too much, too complicated.
And that perception, that perceived complexity is really the crux of the problem they identify.
How so?
Well, when the science seems overwhelming or it takes too long to get answers, it lags behind the critics and the political demands.
Ah, okay.
And that gap, that vacuum, the authors argue, it opens the door for politics to take over. It encourages what they bluntly call faith-based solutions.
Meaning decisions based more on belief or pressure than solid science.
Precisely. Ideology, maybe fear, rather than rigorous analysis. It's a tough spot for managers.
And understanding how we got here means looking back a bit at the policy shifts.
Definitely. You really have to go back to the 70s, to UN Soleil's, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That was foundational. It basically extended national control over marine resources further offshore.
Gave countries more responsibility, essentially.
Yeah, it changed the whole game. Before that, a lot of management was more localized or, just based on tradition.
But the ecosystem part, that came later, right? With things like the Reykjavik Declaration.
Exactly. That was more the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
These declarations explicitly said, hey, it's not just about the fish you're catching anymore. You need to consider the whole ecosystem.
So the policy ambition kind of leaped ahead of the practical science.
That's a great way to put it. The mandate for this broader ecosystem-level sustainability suddenly became global policy. But the tools, and maybe even the scientific consensus on how to do it, weren't quite there yet.
Creating this tension, this complexity problem that paper tackles.
Exactly. And the paper tries to map out a way through that complexity, bridging the gap between what policy demands and what science can realistically deliver right now.
Okay, let's dive into their first big point. They tackle this pervasive idea. Has conventional single-species fisheries management actually failed? Because the public narrative is often doom and gloom, right? Global collapse.
Yeah, they push back against that narrative pretty strongly. They look at the data, especially from developed countries where data is better, and they say, well, it's more complicated than just failure.
What does the data show then?
Recent assessments, at the time they were writing, suggested fewer than 20% of global stocks were technically overfished or collapsed. Now, that's still too many, obviously, but it's not the total system failure sometimes portrayed.
20%. That's surprisingly lower than you might expect from headlines.
It is, and they make another key point. Some really important ecosystems were actually recovering from past overfishing.
Using the old methods.
Yes, using conventional tools.
Yeah.
Things like really strict catch limits, effective gear restrictions, moving towards rights-based management. These things can work and have worked when they're properly funded and enforced.
So traditional management isn't inherently broken. It's more about implementation and context.
That seems to be the implication for certain situations. Good governance matters. Funding matters.
But here's where the paper gets really interesting, I think. They challenge the very definition of success. It's not just about fish in the water.
Absolutely crucial point. They insist a truly successful fishery has to hit 3 benchmarks. Biological sustainability, yes, but also economic viability and social or societal well-being.
The triple bottom line, essentially.
Right. And applying that standard reveals a lot more weaknesses in conventional approaches. You might have a fishery that looks great biologically, maybe it's even profitable.
But
The social scientists might look at it and say, this is a disaster. Maybe it wiped out small-scale fishers or destroyed a coastal community's traditional way of life. That broader definition raises the bar significantly.
and it's important we mention the caveat here, the data gap.
Huge caveat, that less than 20% figure. It mostly comes from well-monitored industrial fisheries in wealthier nations. It generally doesn't include countless smaller stocks, artisanal fisheries, subsistence fishing.
Or vast areas in Asia and Africa where data is sparse.
Exactly. So the authors are careful. They're saying the picture is mixed where we can see clearly, but globally. We honestly don't have the full picture. The jury is still out.
Okay, so if conventional management isn't a total write-off, why the big push for EAF, which we've established is way more complex, why take on that headache?
Because the goalposts have moved. That policy mandate requires thinking about the ecosystem, the economics, the social side, and as soon as you try to genuinely integrate all that,
Boom. Complexity explodes.
right, it can become paralyzing for the agencies trying to manage it. And that paralysis, again, opens the door for politics and those faith-based decisions because the science seems too slow or uncertain.
Which brings us neatly to their discussion of how to make this transition. They lay out two main paths, EAF versus EBM.
Yes, ecosystem approach to fisheries, EAF, they frame as the evolutionary route. Think of it as adding ecosystem considerations onto the existing fisheries management structures.
So starting with what we have and tweaking it.
Pretty much. You add ecosystem factors incrementally, maybe think about predator-prey interactions for your target species or basic habitat impacts, but only as the science becomes clear and it's, frankly, politically manageable.
The appeal there seems obvious. Less disruption, right? No need to rewrite foundational laws. Fisheries agencies keep their traditional roles.
Exactly. Politically, it's the path of least resistance. It can advance steadily as the science allows. That's the strength.
What's the weakness?
The big weakness is that it allows agencies to stay in their silos. A fisheries department can focus on its fish stocks and maybe factor in some ecosystem links, but it lets them avoid the really hard, messy problems of coordinating with other sectors.
Like coastal development, pollution, agriculture runoff, things that profoundly affect the ecosystem but aren't fishing.
Precisely. EAF often struggles to tackle those cross-sectoral impacts. It remains primarily fisheries-focused.
Which leads to the alternative, EBM, ecosystem-based management. The revolutionary path, as they put it.
Yeah, revolutionary is a good word. EBM flips the script. It starts by trying to understand the entire ecosystem, its structure, its functions, all the major drivers, human and natural.
Get the big picture first.
Right. And then once you have that comprehensive understanding, you ask, okay, how can various human activities, including fishing, fit into this system without fundamentally damaging it?
Ecologically, that sounds much more robust. You're dealing with the big pressures up front.
It is potentially much stronger, yes, but the political hurdles are massive.
Why? What's the pain point?
Integration. Real EBM means fisheries management can't just be done by the fisheries agency anymore. It requires genuine, potentially legally mandated coordination with environment ministries, agriculture, transport, energy, everyone impacting that marine space.
So fisheries agencies lose sole control.
They lose autonomy. It requires shared planning, shared budgets, probably significant legislative changes. And that means turf wars, resistance from sectors that don't want fisheries concerns limiting their activities. It's politically much, much harder.
Okay, let's dig into some specific hurdles they identify. First up, empirical challenges, science itself. They mention this issue of scale.
Yeah, they argue that trying to find the single correct spatial scale for management is, and I quote, futile and misguided.
Why futile?
Because ecosystems just don't work that way. You got enormous forces at play, like climate patterns. Think the North Atlantic Oscillation affecting fish over thousands of kilometers, operating on decadal timescale.
Huge scale.
Right. But then you also have critical factors operating on tiny scales, like the specific condition of a coral reef or a seagrass bed, maybe just tens or hundreds of meters across, can be crucial for certain fish.
So you can't manage both with one approach.
You can't. The scale depends entirely on the issue and the species. They give examples. Managing Pacific sardines means thinking about the whole California current system. Managing a local rockfish population might be about protecting specific rocky outcrops. The management scale has to be flexible, adaptable.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears to the jurisdictional and financial hurdles. This felt really stark in the paper, the link between national wealth and how fisheries are managed.
It's a really striking correlation, they point out. Basically, the countries that report the most fishery collapses and also the most recoveries tend to be the wealthier ones.
That seems counterintuitive at first. Why would richer countries have more collapses?
It's likely an artifact of monitoring and reporting. You have to have the scientific capacity and the resources to actually recognize and document a collapse.
Yeah.
Then you need the wealth to fund the often expensive long-term recovery efforts.
So wealth enables both the diagnosis and the cure, in a way.
That seems to be the pattern. Poor nations might have collapses happening, but lack the resources to fully assess them or implement recovery plans, so they don't show up as clearly in global statistics.
They use the Gulf of Mexico as a prime example of these disparities playing out.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm jurisdictionally. You have the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba all sharing this large marine ecosystem. But there are huge differences in, scientific funding, monitoring capacity, data quality, even basic purchasing power between them.
How does that affect management?
Well, for fish stocks that migrate across those borders, and many do, the U.S. might have good data for its waters, but limited or incompatible data from Mexico or Cuba. So the U.S. often ends up having to assess and manage a shared stock based almost entirely on U.S. data.
Which is ecologically incomplete, obviously.
Completely. The political boundaries literally prevent the kind of integrated ecosystem-wide assessment that EBM would demand for a shared resource like that.
Looking at situations like the Gulf, where you have multiple stressors and these jurisdictional issues, it raises another question the paper addresses. Is just stopping further harm enough? Or do we need active restoration?
Their conclusion is pretty clear. In many, maybe most heavily impacted systems today, simply preventing more damage isn't sufficient. Active restoration is often necessary
Why?
because the damage isn't just from fishing. Think about coastal habitats degraded by pollution, wetlands drained for development, altered freshwater flows from dams, nutrient runoff from farms. In these places, the ecosystem structure is already significantly compromised.
So even if you perfectly manage fishing, the fish populations might not recover because their fundamental habitat or food web is broken.
Exactly. Regulating fishing gear might be almost irrelevant if the nursery habitats have been destroyed by pollution. This really underlines the need for that broader EBM approach in degraded areas.
And they point to examples where this integrated approach is already happening.
Yes, they mentioned large-scale, long-term restoration programs like the Chesapeake Bay, the Everglades, the San Francisco Bay Delta. What these projects consistently show is that restoring fisheries inevitably requires tackling all the stressors.
Pollution, nutrients, water flow.
Everything. You need coordinated action across agriculture, urban development, water management, and fisheries. It's real-world proof that EBM, that integrated approach, is the only way forward in these complex damaged systems. Simple EAF, focused mainly on fishing, just can't cope.
This brings us to what might be the deepest challenge they raise, the societal one. They suggest this could be the ultimate roadblock.
It's a powerful argument. They link it back to human nature, even human evolution, and our relationship with time.
How so?
Well, ecosystem restoration is slow, really slow. You might invest huge amounts of money and effort today, but the tangible benefits might not show up for decades. Full recovery could take centuries.
And we're not great at that kind of long-term thinking.
Generally, no. The paper argues that our societal structures, maybe even our cognitive biases, evolved during millennia of perceived ecological abundance. Short-term thinking, focusing on immediate needs and rewards, was a successful strategy when resources seemed limitless.
But that strategy backfires now.
It's fundamentally mismatched, they argue, with managing what they call an ecology in a time of scarcity. We face real limits now. But society struggles profoundly to accept short-term costs or sacrifices, like reduced fishing quotas or expensive pollution controls, for benefits that are decades away.
You definitely see that playing out. Climate change is the obvious parallel. We know the long-term risks, but the immediate economic costs of action often cause political paralysis.
Precisely. It's that conflict between the ecological timescale and the political or economic timescale.
Does the paper offer any way out of this bind? Are they saying EBM is basically doomed by human nature?
They don't offer a simple solution, no magic bullet, but they emphasize awareness and institutional design. The key is recognizing this inherent bias toward short-term thinking, and then building governance structures, laws, and institutions that deliberately counteract it. Embedding long-term ecological goals into binding frameworks that are somewhat insulated from short-term political cycles or economic pressures.
So making long-term thinking the default institutionally.
Something like that. It's an admission that the hardest part might not be the ecological science, but the sociology and the politics of implementing it over the necessary timescales.
That feels like the critical insight for you, the listener, to take away. If the biggest barriers aren't just about understanding fish biology, but about overcoming our resistance to integrated planning and long-term sacrifice.
Then the real challenge of the ecosystem approach isn't just in the lab or out on the water. It's in town halls, in legislatures, in changing how we collectively value the future.
So let's try to wrap up the main takeaways from this deep dive. First, conventional fisheries management hasn't been a complete failure everywhere, but it often falls short, especially by broader social and economic standards.
Right. And the global mandate has shifted towards demanding that broader ecosystem sustainability.
Which pushes us away from the simpler evolutionary EAF model, just tweaking fisheries management towards the more complex revolutionary EBM model.
Especially in areas that are already heavily degraded or face complex issues like pollution or cross-border management. EBM, that integrated approach, becomes essential there.
But implementing EBM faces huge hurdles. Scientific complexities, scale mismatches, jurisdictional conflicts, funding disparities.
And perhaps the biggest hurdle of all, our societal tendency towards short-term thinking, which clashes fundamentally with the long time scales of ecosystem recovery.
Which leads to the final thought the authors leave us with. Really, it's about time.
It really is. The science of EAF and EBM is complex, yes, but maybe manageable. The social challenge of planning and acting over decades, even centuries, is immense.
So the provocative question for you to consider is this. Given that we seem wired for the short term, especially when resources feel scarce, what immediate sacrifices or trade-offs are we as individuals, as communities, as nations willing to make today?
What are we willing to invest or forego now to ensure healthier, more resilient oceans and fisheries 50 or 100 years down the line? Grappling with that question, overcoming that inherent short-term bias, might be the single most important factor determining whether the ecosystem approach truly succeeds. That's the deeper challenge this paper illuminates.